now is the time to really look into adding it to your options for your players.
But there must be some risks involved. I mean, there's been a lot in the news in the last year, Mt. Gox in Japan, some fraud in Hong Kong.
But the reason operators aren't embracing this as wholeheartedly as we are is number one, there's like a technical kind of big dragon over there. There's this, I guess there's a technical knowledge requirement it's very involved and quite specific and quite complicated, but you can outsource that component. Number two is the value of the currency has in the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years fluctuated quite wildly. That also will scare operators, especially when they're running complex risk models to manage sports books and things like that. So these are things that I see, and Kevin can expand on this being on the operator side, but these are things that I see as reasons why operators are reluctant, but they can all be overcome.
Just, you mentioned the currency fluctuation because I think Bitcoin reached a high of, $1,100, US, and then it's down around 500, I believe, at the moment. That obviously for some people is a big red flag. But what could an industry or a company do to manage that risk with Bitcoin, or is that risk actually real?
Look, as an operator, there's basically two ways that you can choose to embrace Bitcoin, right? One of which is to offer you games in Bitcoin-denominated currency. So the player would deposit Bitcoin, they'd wager in Bitcoin, they'd bet on casino games, poker games, sports games, whatever, and then withdraw in Bitcoin. Now that's probably terrifying for a lot of operators because they do take on this currency risk. They might take a bet at a Bitcoin worth $1,200 when the player withdraws that it's worth $2,200, and all of a sudden you've got to go find a way to raise some money. But the second way, which is probably like an easier way for an operator to get their feet wet, is to just sell Bitcoin at the point of transaction. So a player would deposit Bitcoin, but their account will be credited in the dollar, euro, pound equivalent at that moment in time. The wagering would take place in exactly the same way as it did previously. They bet dollars, euros, pounds. And when the time comes for the player to cash out, they buy Bitcoin on the spot at a market rate and send them to the player. So this way, the operator takes no currency risk at all. The player takes some currency risk, but in my experience, the players are very willing to take that currency risk.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are also a few solutions out there where players can deposit into an e-wallet, and in that e-wallet, it'll show the local currency that that player is playing with. Then they log into the operator site, log into their e-wallet, and can simply transfer the amount from that local currency into their account. It's very similar to what Jatine was saying, but that's also another viable option that players like.
I just want to add one thing for the existing operators, because they always take care of like the players, because this is quite a new concept, and people just find difficult to accept like as a new payment solution. So that's why the operator just worrying about they will lose the existing customers if they using the Bitcoin. So that's why I think it can be the alternative solution, but it's very hard to replace the existing ones.
I think it is about educating people as well.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very, as a panel, you're all very evangelical about usage, but what freaks out governments is it's not regulated. So from that perspective, do you all feel, or only some of you feel, that it should be regulated in some way, shape, or form? Because that's what unsettles people is they can't understand it, and there's no stamp of approval of from some government authority. It's not currency that's governmental backed or anything, and that's what unsettles people.
Well, from a gaming perspective, like some operators can only work with payment processors that are licensed in a certain way. So for that reason, there would have to be an element of regulation, right?
That's certainly the case now in the UK. They've changed the regulation.
Yeah, so there you go. So for that reason, yeah, there would need to be an element of it. But having said that, like regulation on its bare bones effectively is to provide accountability and protection. And you can do that in other ways with Bitcoin, because all transactions are publicly viewable in the public ledger called a blockchain. Like there's so many ways that companies can mathematically prove their assets and mathematically prove their protocols, and like mathematical proof is better than any regulator could ever ask you to provide. But yeah, as you say, there has to be an element of regulation, I think, for the purposes of gaming, because otherwise you'd lose a whole bunch of operators.
Just to touch on that, and this is one of the things that I personally love about Bitcoin, the difficulty of the types of regulations that are in place for other payment type sources, because Bitcoin is not a company. It's not an organization. You can't go in and tax the Bitcoin company. So the regulations that are in place right now aren't necessarily fit for this new thing, this cryptocurrency. So it's going to be very interesting, and certainly companies can still follow all the KYC and AML requirements, so that's not an issue. But again, you cannot go in and shut down, let's say, a company like you could shut down Visa, or if it were. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so we're talking about regulation, and we're in Asia. I'm from Taiwan, and so Bitcoin in Taiwan basically is unregulated, except that we have some guidance from the government that it falls under some existing regulations, although it's not entirely clear which ones. The head of the central bank has said it should be treated like a commodity. The Financial Supervisory Commission has said it's not a currency, and they've warned consumers not to use it, but it is entirely legal, and it is considered something that can be subject to a contract for barter, as well as something for a purchase and sale agreement. Anyone want to give perspectives from some other jurisdictions on Bitcoin?
I think in China, the central government, they not regulated the Bitcoin, but the central bank gives some policies that just try to destroy like the relation between the banks and the Bitcoin operators. That means they just shut down the operators' accounts in the bank to stop like exchange their money with the Bitcoin. So that's like the drawback for
You've got, the FinCEN regulation crept in the US, but the European Central Bank did a review a couple of years ago in which they looked at this. Then they are keeping a watching brief over it, but essentially they've said it doesn't fall within the financial services regulation. They don't regard it to be e-money, even though it's a form of digital money, and that's partly how the value is actually pegged. So at the moment, they're content to adopt a laissez-faire attitude on the basis they don't feel it's big enough yet. So I think the whole point of the conversation really is, isn't it, is, ultimately you'll be victims of one's own success, because the more successful it is, the more people who start using it, the more likely it is that someone is going to regulate it, either in relation to gaming regulation, as you quite rightly say, or in relation to financial services, or quasi-financial services, or indeed consumer protection.